Card flip animations have been around for a while. You've probably seen them in action somewhere on the web. Some of the best case uses are cards, offers, testimonials, product covers, etc. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how you can create a cool 3D flipping animation effect with nothing else but pure CSS. You can do this both vertically and horizontally, and they follow the same principle. I'm going to be covering the horizontal flip here. In order to get started, we'll begin by just looking at a simple image. So I'm going to go ahead and create a section tag. And inside this section, I'll have an image tag. As you can see, the web page is simply going to display an image of the whale shark. Now, to begin with, I just simply want to show you the principle behind what we're going to be using to create this flip. I'll go ahead and make a style tag. And inside the style tag, I'm simply going to transform the image tag and have it scale in -1. If we save the page and refresh, you can see that the image has been flipped on the y-axis. This is just one simple CSS property, and by using it, your image is already flipped. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this sort of principle and make it more practical and more functional. Let me get rid of this image rule, and what we'll do is we'll set up some code for our card. Again, I'm going to wrap the card inside the section tag. So I'll go ahead and just create a div with a class of card. And inside this div, I'm going to create an h1, and we'll go ahead and use the same image of the whale shark. So if I save the page now, we're going to just see our h1 and then our image. Let's add some CSS for these elements. I'll start off by adding a rule for the card element, and I'm going to begin by simply assigning a width of 400 pixels and a height of auto. This is going to resize the image, and it is probably worth noting that I do have an external style sheet that has some basic styles attached as universal selectors, some padding on the body, some formatting for the H1, an image rule that is ensuring that the image is responsive, and then on the section tag, which is the parent, I'm using flex so that I can align the elements to the center of the section tag. Now, to make this look a little bit more card-like, I'm going to add a border radius of 10 pixels, and I'll add a box shadow to ensure that this has a little bit of a drop shadow. If we save and refresh, you can see that it simply is going to put a drop shadow and round the corners on the card element. Now, in order to make this fully functional, we're going to want to create two sides for the card, the front and the back. And since our card would change its position on an event, we are going to actually use opacity to hide one side of the card at any given time. So when we hover over, or on a mobile when we click, our card is going to flip. We want to prevent the movement from being jerky or choppy. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to use some CSS magic to ensure that this happens. To keep things simple and organized, I'm going to wrap both the front and the back sides of our card inside of our card div. Let's go ahead and let's modify this code a little bit. I'll change the div to an article tag, and I'm going to leave the class of card. And then inside of this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a div with a class of front. This will be the front of my card. I'll make a header tag, and the header tag is going to contain an H1 that says whale shark and an H3. That is going to be it for the front portion of the card. We're going to make the image appear as a background image, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Next, I'm going to make the back of the card. And again, the back of the card is going to have some text that says whale shark, and then we'll add a paragraph with some text that describes whale sharks. And after that, I'm going to create an image And this is simply going to be an icon of a whale shark that we're going to use on our page. I'll give this image a class of icon so we can hook it with our CSS. If I save now and I refresh, this is what the page currently looks like. So this is the text that's going to appear on the front of the card. This is the text and the icon that will appear ultimately on the back of the card. So let's go ahead and let's add some additional rules to our card element. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a position of relative. This is going to be necessary so that we can actually position the back of the card behind the front by default. In addition to this, I'm going to go ahead and set the width of the card to 300 pixels. So we initially set that to be 400, but I'm going to make it a little bit more narrow. Next, I'm going to make a selector that is going to target both the front and the back. So we'll make a group selector here. And here we're going to go ahead and set the height of the card to be 400 pixels. And we're going to add some padding so that the text isn't going right to the edge of the card. If I refresh and save, you can see the modifications that have happened thus far. Next, I'm going to go ahead and resize the icon element. So we'll go ahead and just set the width of this element to 20% to make it quite a bit smaller. And I'm going to tell this element to display as inline block. Next, I'm going to go ahead and set the text color for the header tag, and we'll just go ahead and set the color of these elements to white. So that's going to be my whale shark and my H3 whale shark fish. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make a rule for the front of the card. For the front of the card, I'll go ahead and set the border radius, and we'll set that to 10 pixels. We're going to go ahead and we're going to set the background size, and we'll set that to cover. I'm going to set my background repeat to be no repeat. And we're going to go ahead and set our background image, and we'll go ahead and target our whale shark image, and I'm going to set the background position to center. As you can see, the whale shark image is now going to appear, and now that the whale shark image is there as a background image, the text is going to show up. Now let me just set some formatting for the back of the card. So I'm going to go ahead and set the H1 on the back of the card, and we'll go ahead and just set the color of that to be a teal color and margin bottom to be 0.5 ems. I'll also set the margin bottom on the paragraph tag to 0.5 ems as well. And as you can see, that we're just going to create a little space and we're setting a color on this. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to go ahead and make a rule for the H3 on the front of the card. We'll resize the text down just a little bit, and I'm going to set my font weight to be a lighter weight. There we go. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the transform function to rotate the front of the card. So we already have a rule for the front of the card. I'm just going to come up here and add the transform, and we're going to go ahead and tell it to rotate in the Y direction, and I'm going to rotate 0 degrees. Now, if we refresh, you're going to see that no change is going to occur on the front. The reason that I'm adding this property and value is because we're going to be transitioning this particular value, but I need to set it to an initial value. So it's important that we include that so that initially the front of the card is facing the correct way. What we'll do next is we're going to make a rule for the back of the card. And on the back of the card, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use transform. And again, we're going to rotate in the Y direction. But this time I'm going to rotate negative 180 degrees. So essentially I'm going to be flipping the card in the opposite direction. Now I'm showing you this now so you can see what happens. This card is of course not going to be visible initially. And then when we hover or click on the front of the card, it's going to flip 180 degrees And while that's happening, the back of the card is going to flip 180 degrees and be facing the correct direction. We'll be using a little CSS animation to make this occur. Before we do that though, let's go ahead and let's add some other properties. I need both my width and my height to be 100%. We're also going to use position absolute, so we can absolutely position the back of the card. I'll set the top to 0 and the left value to 0 as well. As you can see, when I refresh, the card is going to be positioned precisely on top of the front of the card. Now, because we don't want this to initially be visible, I'm going to also add an opacity property and set the opacity to 0. This is going to hide the back of the card by default. So if I refresh now, we no longer see the back of the card, which is exactly what we want. So what we're going to do now is we're going to make some rules for the cards when we're hovering on both the front and the back. And I'll go ahead and I'll add these to the bottom of my embedded styles. I'll start off with the front. So I'm going to make a rule for .card::hover, and then we'll target front. And I'm going to go ahead and use transform. We're going to rotate in Y, and we're going to set this to 180 degrees. Now remember, initially, the front of the card has been set to a rotation value of 0. So if we save and we refresh, when I hover over, you can see that the card simply flips back and forth. Okay, so this is the initial settings that we want. I'm going to go ahead and just copy this rule. I'll paste it in, and we'll change this to back. And for the back, we're going to go ahead and transform to 0 degrees. And then we also want to add the property of opacity. And we're going to set the opacity to 1, which will essentially make the back of the card become visible. Okay, so you can see the back of the card is now visible and the text is facing the correct way. Now, because we don't want the text overlaying on top of the front of the card, we're going to need to add a background color to both of the cards to ensure that we can't kind of see through. So what we're going to do to ensure that the text is not bleeding through is we're going to make a group selector for both front and back. And we'll just set the background color to be white. Now, when I refresh, you can see that when I hover over, the card is going to switch. So this is working for the most part, but what we ultimately want to do is we want to create this animation so that it actually goes ahead and performs the flip. We're going to do that by setting a rule on both front and back for transition. And we're going to go ahead and request that we do a transition property. And the properties that we want to transition are going to be transform and opacity. We're going to add a transition duration, and we'll have this occur in 0.5 seconds. And then I'm going to use a transition timing function. And for the transition timing function, we could use a number of things. I've chosen to use cubic Bezier. So I'm going to plug in some values, and I kind of played around and I found values that are going to work for my purposes. You could use ease in and ease out, or easy ease, or whatever you want. You might want to play around with some of the settings. But after doing some experimentation, I found that I liked these the best. If I refresh my page and I hover over, you can see how I now have a really nice switch. The only problem is if you look carefully, you can see that the border of the card is not transitioning, just the front and the back. So remember that we had initially put our border radius and the box shadow on the card. I'm going to cut both of these properties, and we're just going to simply move this to the front and the back of the card. I guess I had a group selector right here that we could have used, but I went ahead and just made it again down here. It's not quite as specific, but it still works. So I'll go ahead and I'll paste those in. If we save now and refresh, you can see that I get a really lovely card flip animation. So this works on hover, and if I'm on a mobile, all I have to do is click and it'll have the same behavior. So I can see the card, I hover over, I can see the back of the card, and when I mouse away, it goes back to the front. So I really like this technique. I find it to be very useful. It adds a little pizzazz to your web page, and you can really get fancy with this and do all sorts of really cool things by utilizing this sort of technique. As you can see, using a little bit of CSS and simply using rotation and transforming that, and then using transition to animate it, allows us to create a really dynamic web page. And it's pretty simple and just uses pure CSS.